She thought humiliating a stranger would be just another display of power, but in less than 10 minutes, the entire room would witness a reversal no one would ever forget. The restaurant glowed under warm golden chandeliers, their light reflecting across polished marble floors and crystal glassware. A place where reservations were measured in months and status was worn as visibly as tailored suits and diamond jewelry. And into that carefully curated world walked Emily Carter, her soft beige dress simple, her hair loosely tied back, her presence quiet enough that most people barely noticed her at first glance. And that was exactly how she preferred it, moving with calm intention toward the hostess stand as if she belonged there without needing to prove it, her eyes steady, her posture relaxed, a woman accustomed to being underestimated. Though no one in that room could have guessed the life she lived beyond that moment or the choices that shaped her simplicity. And across the room, seated at a table near the center where attention naturally gathered, Victoria Sterling noticed her almost instantly, not because Emily stood out, but because she didn't. And to Victoria, that absence of visible status was an invitation to judge, her manicured fingers pausing midair as she tilted her head slightly, scanning Emily from head to toe with a gaze sharpened by years of social dominance. The kind of look that didn't just observe but categorized, dismissed, and filed away in a fraction of a second, and the faint curl of her lips said everything her words had not yet spoken. Because in Victoria's world, appearance was currency, and Emily, in her eyes, had none. And as the quiet hum of conversation continued around them, something subtle began to shift in the atmosphere, an almost imperceptible tension forming like the air before a storm. Because moments like these never unfolded loudly at first, they built quietly, invisibly, carried by assumptions and pride. And while Emily simply approached the front desk to confirm her reservation, her voice soft but clear, Victoria leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving her, a slow, deliberate interest taking hold, not curiosity, but something colder, something that thrived on comparison and control. And though no one else seemed to notice yet, the first thread of what would become an unforgettable moment had already been pulled, stretching across the room, tightening with every passing second. Because the truth about power is this: it reveals itself not in how loudly it speaks, but in how quickly it changes the silence around it. And on that evening, in that room filled with wealth and appearances, silence was about to become louder than anyone expected. Emily Carter stood at the hostess stand with quiet patience, her hands resting lightly against the polished marble as the young hostess glanced between the reservation screen and Emily's modest appearance, hesitation flickering across her face for just a moment too long. And though the delay was subtle, it did not go unnoticed by those who were trained to read such moments, especially Victoria Sterling, whose interest had now sharpened into something more deliberate, her chair turning slightly as she angled her body for a better view, her bracelet catching the chandelier light as she lifted her glass with slow precision, watching as if she were observing a performance unfold for her own amusement. And across the room a few nearby diners began to follow her gaze, curiosity spreading quietly, because attention in a place like this often moved with hierarchy. And when someone like Victoria watched, others instinctively did the same. And Emily, unaware or perhaps simply unconcerned, spoke again with gentle clarity, confirming her name, her tone calm and unhurried, the kind of composure that did not seek validation. And yet that very calmness seemed to irritate something beneath Victoria's polished exterior, because there was a difference between confidence earned through status and confidence that existed without it. And Victoria recognized the difference immediately, though she could not explain why it unsettled her. And so she did what she had always done in moments like this: she leaned into it, her voice cutting through the ambient noise just enough to be heard without appearing loud, a carefully measured projection that carried weight. Without effort, asking the hostess if everything was all right, her words framed as concern but laced with unmistakable judgment. And the hostess stiffened slightly, glancing toward Victoria before responding to Emily with a tighter smile, her tone shifting, becoming more formal, more cautious, as if navigating an invisible pressure. And the room responded in kind, the quiet hum softening into something more attentive, more aware. As conversations dipped and eyes lingered, and Victoria rose slowly from her seat, her heels echoing softly against the marble as she approached, each step deliberate, each movement practiced, the kind of presence that demanded space without asking for it. And when she stopped a few feet from Emily, the contrast between them became impossible to ignore, one dressed in effortless simplicity, the other in curated elegance. And for a brief moment neither spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional. And then Victoria smiled, not warmly, but precisely, her eyes scanning Emily once more before she spoke, her voice smooth, almost pleasant, asking if Emily was certain she had the correct reservation, suggesting with subtle emphasis that mistakes like this happened all the time, especially in places that required a certain standard. And though her words were carefully chosen, their meaning was unmistakable, and a few quiet murmurs rippled through nearby tables, the kind that carried judgment without commitment. And Emily met her gaze, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady in a way that neither challenged nor retreated, simply present. And for a second, something unfamiliar flickered across Victoria's face, a brief disruption in her certainty, before it disappeared behind another composed smile. Because in her world, doubt was not something she allowed to linger, and as the tension in the room tightened almost imperceptibly, it became clear that what had begun as a passing observation was now something else entirely. Something unfolding in real time, pulling everyone within its quiet gravity. And still, Emily remained exactly as she was, calm, composed, and unmoved, as if she already understood something the rest of the room had yet to realize. Victoria Sterling let out a soft, amused exhale, the kind that was not quite laughter but carried the same sharp edge, her gaze fixed on Emily Carter as if she had already reached a conclusion that required no further evidence. And with a subtle tilt of her head she stepped closer, invading just enough space to make her presence undeniable, her voice lowering slightly, yet somehow carrying farther across the room, asking again if Emily was certain she belonged here, this time with a faint emphasis that turned the question into something far more pointed. And the nearby diners leaned in without appearing to do so, forks pausing midair, conversations thinning into fragments, because moments like this had a way of pulling attention without permission. And Emily, still composed, met her eyes with the same steady calm, her response simple, confirming her reservation once more, her tone neither defensive nor apologetic, which only seemed to deepen the tension rather than diffuse it. Because there was no reaction for Victoria to push against, no visible discomfort to validate her assumptions, and for someone accustomed to control, that absence created its own kind of irritation, and so she shifted tactics, her smile sharpening just slightly as she gestured lightly around the room, referencing the exclusivity of the restaurant, the standards they upheld, the clientele they served. Her words wrapped in polished language, but unmistakably exclusionary, and a quiet murmur spread among a few guests who now openly watched, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment, some aligning with Victoria's confidence, others simply waiting to see how far this would go. And the hostess, caught between politeness and pressure, hesitated again, her fingers hovering over the screen as if searching for a resolution that would satisfy both sides. And that hesitation, small as it was, became the tipping point, because it signaled doubt, and doubt in a place built on certainty was all Victoria needed, her posture straightening as she leaned in just enough for Emily to hear clearly, her voice now carrying a trace of impatience, suggesting that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding, that reservations of this nature were often misinterpreted, especially by those unfamiliar with how things worked here. And though the words remained technically courteous, their intent was unmistakable, drawing a sharper reaction from the room. A few exchanged glances, a raised eyebrow, the subtle tightening of a jaw, and still, Emily did not waver, her hand moving calmly to retrieve her phone, presenting the confirmation without haste, her movements deliberate and unshaken. And for a brief moment, the balance shifted, the proof undeniable, the hostess's expression changing as she recognized the name, the table, the legitimacy. But before that realization could settle fully, Victoria spoke again, her tone now edged with something less controlled, a faint impatience that betrayed the crack forming beneath her composed exterior, dismissing the confirmation with a casual wave, implying that mistakes could still happen, that appearances often told a clearer story than digital confirmations. And that was when the atmosphere tightened completely. The room no longer pretending not to watch, the silence growing heavier, almost tangible, as if everyone present understood that something irreversible was about to occur, because the line between subtle insult and open humiliation was thinning rapidly, and Victoria, whether by habit or choice, showed no intention of stepping back, her confidence carrying her forward as she prepared to make her point unmistakably clear, while Emily remained exactly where she stood, calm, grounded, her eyes steady in a way that did not challenge yet did not yield, a stillness that contrasted so sharply with the rising tension that it felt almost deliberate. And in that stillness, something shifted again, something unseen but undeniable, as if the moment itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Victoria Sterling's smile thinned into something sharper, more deliberate, as she looked at the confirmation on Emily Carter's phone and then back at her, as if the proof itself had somehow offended her, and instead of stepping back, she leaned further in, her voice dropping into a quieter tone that somehow carried even more weight, suggesting that reservations could be transferred, screens could be manipulated, and that establishments like this relied on more than just what was shown on a device. Her words drawing a subtle but audible reaction from those closest to them, a few shifting in their seats, others exchanging glances that hovered between discomfort and anticipation, because the moment had clearly crossed into something else now, something no longer masked by politeness, and the hostess, visibly uneasy, attempted to interject, her voice careful, confirming that the reservation did in fact match Emily's name, her tone offering a path toward resolution. But Victoria dismissed it with a small, almost dismissive wave of her hand, as if the explanation was irrelevant, as if she alone could define what belonged and what did not. And that was when the tension reached its sharpest edge, the room quieting to a level that felt almost unnatural, as if every sound had been pulled back to make space for what was about to happen. And Victoria, standing now fully within Emily's space, tilted her head slightly, her expression composed, but her eyes carrying something colder, something more personal, as she made a final remark about how certain standards existed for a reason, that places like this were not meant to be confusing, and that sometimes it was better for people to recognize where they truly fit, her words landing with a precision that no longer hid their intent, and a few soft reactions rippled through the nearby tables, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to signal that the line had been crossed, and still, Emily did not react, her composure unwavering, her eyes steady in a way that did not challenge yet did not retreat, a stillness that seemed almost out of place in the face of such open condescension, and that stillness, that refusal to engage on the level expected, seemed to unsettle Victoria more than any argument could have, because it denied her the response she had anticipated, the validation of superiority she had built her entire presence upon, and for a brief moment, something flickered again beneath her confidence, a crack so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not paying attention, but it was there, and perhaps sensing it, or perhaps determined to push past it, Victoria made a final, decisive movement, lifting her glass slightly, her expression calm, almost casual, as if what she was about to do was nothing more than a passing gesture. And in that suspended moment, time seemed to slow, the light catching the edge of the glass, the reflections shifting across the marble, the entire room holding its breath without realizing it, because there are moments when everything changes not through noise, but through a single action that cannot be undone. And as Victoria completed that gesture, subtle yet unmistakable, the atmosphere collapsed into a silence so complete it felt almost physical, conversations stopping mid-sentence, movements freezing, eyes widening, because what had just happened was no longer subtle, no longer layered beneath politeness. It was clear, undeniable, and in that instant, every person in that room understood that the balance had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. And at the center of it all, Emily stood perfectly still, her expression unchanged, her gaze steady, as if the moment itself had revealed far more than anyone had intended. For a fraction of a second, no one moved, no one spoke, and even the soft clinking of glassware seemed to disappear as the weight of what had just happened settled over the room. Because there are moments when silence does not come from calm, but from shock, and this was one of them. and at the center of it all stood Emily Carter, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, as if the action meant to humiliate her had somehow failed to land where it was intended, her hand lifting slowly, not in anger, not in panic, but with a quiet, deliberate grace as she reached for a folded napkin from the edge of the hostess stand, dabbing her cheek with a precision that carried more control than any reaction could have. And that single movement, simple as it was, shifted something intangible in the room, because it denied the spectacle that had just been created. It refused to turn the moment into what Victoria Sterling had expected, and, for the first time since she had approached, Victoria's confidence flickered, just slightly, her smile tightening at the edges as she watched Emily's calm response, as if the absence of visible distress had disrupted the outcome she had already imagined. And around them, the audience that had gathered without gathering began to shift, subtle changes in posture, in expression, in the way eyes moved from one woman to the other, because perception was changing, slowly but unmistakably, and the hostess, clearly unsettled, stepped forward again, her voice careful, asking if everything was all right, though the question carried more uncertainty than reassurance, and Emily lowered the napkin, her gaze steady, her voice soft yet clear as she replied that she was fine, the words simple, almost understated, but delivered with a calm that resonated far beyond their volume, and that calmness, that refusal to escalate, seemed to ripple outward, creating a contrast so sharp that it made the earlier action feel smaller, less powerful than it had been intended to be. And Victoria, sensing the shift even if she could not fully understand it, straightened her posture, her chin lifting slightly as if to reclaim control of the narrative, her voice returning, though now with a sharper edge beneath its polished surface, suggesting that some people misunderstood boundaries, that certain spaces required a level of awareness not everyone possessed, her words still crafted to sound refined, yet now carrying a trace of defensiveness that had not been there before, and a few nearby diners exchanged glances that no longer aligned as clearly with her, the certainty she had projected beginning to fracture under the weight of the moment. And still, Emily did not respond in kind, her silence becoming something else entirely, no longer passive, but purposeful, a quiet presence that held its ground without force. And it was in that stillness that something else began to change, something beyond the immediate tension, because at the far end of the room, near the entrance where the soft glow of evening light filtered through the glass doors, a figure had just stepped inside, unnoticed by most, but not for long. And as he paused for the briefest moment, taking in the scene before him, there was a subtle shift in the air, almost imperceptible at first, like the beginning of a current moving through still water, and though no one had spoken his name, though no introduction had been made, there was something about his presence that carried weight, something that did not announce itself yet demanded attention all the same. And as he began to walk forward, measured, composed, his gaze fixed on a single point across the room, the fragile balance that had just begun to settle was about to be broken once again, but this time, not by arrogance, not by assumption, but by something far more undeniable. And as the distance between him and the center of the room slowly closed, the silence deepened, as if the moment itself understood that everything was about to change. The man did not rush, and that was the first thing people noticed, because in a room where urgency often signaled importance, his calm, measured pace carried something far more commanding, each step deliberate against the marble floor, the subtle echo drawing attention without effort, and one by one, conversations that had only just begun to recover faded again, heads turning not out of curiosity this time, but recognition, the kind that spread quietly yet quickly, as if an unspoken understanding was passing from one table to the next. And though Victoria Sterling had not yet turned, she felt it, the shift behind her, the subtle change in the air that no amount of control could fully mask, her posture stiffening almost imperceptibly as the presence approached. And Emily Carter, still composed, lifted her eyes just slightly, not surprised, not relieved, simply acknowledging what she already seemed to know was coming. And when the man finally stopped beside her, the distance between them closing with quiet certainty, he did not speak immediately, his gaze resting on Emily first, taking in the moment without interruption, a brief pause that carried more weight than any immediate reaction could have. And then, with a gentle movement, he reached into his pocket and produced a clean handkerchief, offering it to her without a word. The gesture simple, almost understated, yet executed with a level of care that shifted the emotional center of the room entirely, because it was not about the act itself, but what it represented, and Emily accepted it with a small nod, her expression unchanged but her eyes softening just slightly. And only then did he turn his attention outward, his posture straightening not with arrogance, but with quiet authority, his presence filling the space in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And Victoria, finally facing him, felt the moment before recognition, that fraction of a second where certainty begins to falter, her eyes scanning his face, her mind searching for context. And then it came, sudden and unmistakable, the shift from confidence to realization, her expression freezing mid-thought as the name formed silently in her mind. Because Daniel Carter was not a man one simply overlooked, not in a city where influence traveled faster than introductions, not in a room where reputation carried more weight than appearance. And the ripple effect was immediate, the hostess straightening, nearby diners exchanging quick glances, a server pausing mid-step as the recognition spread, subtle yet undeniable. And Daniel did not raise his voice, did not demand attention. He did not need to, because it was already his gaze moving slowly across the room before returning to Victoria, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with a calm that felt far more controlled, far more precise. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, measured, carrying just enough volume to reach those closest without breaking the stillness, asking a simple question that cut through everything that had just happened, not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakably direct. And in that moment, the balance that had once favored Victoria completely dissolved, leaving behind a silence that no longer belonged to her, but to him. And for the first time since she had entered this situation, Victoria Sterling found herself without the one thing she had relied on most, certainty, as the reality of who now stood before her began to settle in, reshaping the entire moment in a way she could no longer control. Victoria Sterling's lips parted slightly, but no words came out at first, because recognition does not always arrive with clarity. Sometimes it arrives like a sudden loss of ground beneath your feet. And in that moment, that was exactly what she felt, her carefully constructed confidence faltering as Daniel Carter's presence settled fully into the space, his calm gaze fixed on her, not hostile, not raised, but unwavering in a way that left no room for deflection. And around them, the room had shifted entirely, the earlier tension replaced by something sharper, something quieter, as if every person present understood that whatever happened next would define the moment far more than anything that had come before. And Daniel's voice, when he spoke again, carried the same measured tone, asking Victoria to clarify what had just occurred, not accusing, not assuming, simply stating the question with a precision that made it impossible to ignore. And Victoria's throat tightened as she tried to respond, her usual composure slipping just enough for those closest to notice, her words beginning with a polite attempt to reframe the situation, suggesting that there had been a misunderstanding, that tensions had been high, that perhaps things had been misinterpreted. But even as she spoke, the weakness in the explanation was clear, the certainty she once held dissolving under the weight of Daniel's quiet attention. And Emily stood beside him, still composed, her silence now carrying a different kind of presence, no longer overlooked, no longer dismissed, but central to everything unfolding. And that shift did not go unnoticed, not by the staff, not by the guests, and certainly not by Victoria, who could feel the balance slipping further with every passing second, her mind searching for a way to regain control, to restore the narrative she had so confidently directed only moments ago. But Daniel did not allow the moment to drift, his posture steady as he took a small step forward, not invading, not threatening, simply closing the distance enough to make his presence undeniable. And with that single movement, the space seemed to realign around him. The hostess straightening further, a manager appearing quietly at the edge of the scene, drawn by the unmistakable shift in atmosphere. And Daniel's gaze moved briefly to Emily before returning to Victoria, a subtle acknowledgement that spoke volumes without words. And then he spoke again, his voice calm yet firm, stating that respect was not situational, that it did not depend on appearances or assumptions, and that what had just occurred reflected something far more serious than a misunderstanding. And the words settled into the room with a weight that no raised voice could have matched, because they were not delivered for effect, they were delivered with certainty, and Victoria felt it. The realization that this was no longer a social interaction she could navigate with charm or status. This was something else entirely, something grounded, controlled, and beyond her influence. And for the first time, her eyes dropped, just briefly, a small but telling break in her composure, before lifting again with a forced steadiness, her voice quieter now, less certain, offering an apology that sounded more like an attempt to contain the situation than a genuine acknowledgement. And around them, the silence held, not empty, but charged, as if the entire room was waiting to see whether words alone would be enough to repair what had already been set into motion. And in that suspended moment, it became clear that the power in the room had shifted completely, no longer defined by who spoke first or who stood tallest, but by who remained steady when everything else began to fall apart. Victoria Sterling's apology lingered in the air, but it did not land the way she intended, because it was not rooted in reflection, it was driven by fear, and that difference was something everyone in the room could feel even if no one said it out loud. Her voice softer now, her posture no longer commanding but carefully held together, as if each word she spoke was an attempt to regain ground that had already disappeared beneath her. And Daniel Carter did not interrupt her, he allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for the weight of her words to reveal themselves, his expression unchanged, his gaze steady, and when she finished, the room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for his response, because this was no longer about what had happened, it was about what would happen next. And Daniel shifted his attention briefly to the manager who had quietly approached, a man who now stood with visible tension in his shoulders, aware that the situation had moved far beyond routine, and with a calm that never broke. Daniel spoke, his tone even, requesting that the incident be addressed properly, not privately, not quietly, but in a way that reflected the standards the establishment claimed to uphold. And those words, simple as they were, carried an undeniable authority, not loud, not forceful, but absolute. And the manager nodded quickly, his expression tightening as he turned toward Victoria, the shift in allegiance now unmistakable, because in a place built on reputation, the presence of someone like Daniel did not just influence the moment, it redefined it. And Victoria felt that shift more than anyone, her eyes moving quickly between them, her confidence unraveling in small, visible ways, the certainty that had once defined her now replaced by something far less stable, something reactive. And for a brief second, she attempted once more to recover, offering to make things right, her voice carefully controlled, but the effort rang hollow, because the room had already changed, the audience no longer passive, their expressions no longer neutral, and Emily Carter, who had remained silent through it all, finally spoke again, her voice soft but clear, not directed at Victoria, not even at Daniel, but simply present, stating that respect should never need to be demanded, and the simplicity of her words cut deeper than any confrontation could have, because they carried no anger, no accusation, only truth. And that truth settled into the space with a finality that left no room for interpretation, and Victoria's composure faltered completely for the first time, her eyes lowering again, her shoulders no longer held with the same precision, as if the weight of the moment had finally reached her. And around them, the room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of tension, it was the silence of understanding. The kind that follows when something has been revealed that cannot be undone. And Daniel, after a brief pause, turned slightly toward Emily, his expression softening just enough to be noticed, before guiding her gently away from the center of attention, not with urgency, not with display, but with quiet intention. And as they moved, the space they left behind felt different, as if the energy had shifted permanently, leaving Victoria standing where she was, no longer the center of control, but the center of consequence. And though no one spoke, the message was clear in every glance, every still posture, every unspoken reaction. Because in that moment, the room had witnessed something far more powerful than status. It had witnessed the quiet collapse of arrogance in the face of dignity, and that was something no apology could fully repair. The sound of footsteps and quiet conversation slowly returned as Emily Carter and Daniel Carter moved away from the center of the room, not hurried, not seeking attention, but leaving behind a silence that lingered far longer than their presence. And as they reached their table, the atmosphere shifted once more, softer now, yet undeniably changed, as if everyone present had just witnessed something that would stay with them long after the evening ended. And across the restaurant, glances continued to drift toward Victoria Sterling, who remained standing where she had been, her posture no longer composed with precision, but held together by effort, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table as if grounding herself in a moment that had slipped beyond her control. And though no one approached her, the absence of attention spoke louder than anything else, because the same room that had once followed her lead now regarded her differently, not with admiration, not even with open judgment, but with a quiet distance that could not be ignored. And the manager, returning to his duties with careful professionalism, ensured that the situation was addressed in a manner that reflected the standards Daniel had spoken of, his tone measured, his actions deliberate, creating a resolution that was not dramatic, not public in spectacle, but clear in its consequence. And Victoria listened, nodding when required, her voice low when she responded. But the shift in her demeanor was unmistakable, the confidence that once defined her now replaced by a subdued awareness, as if the moment had revealed something she could not easily dismiss. And at their table, Emily sat with the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning, her hands resting lightly in front of her, her gaze steady. And Daniel, seated beside her, did not speak immediately, his attention on her rather than the room. His expression softened in a way that contrasted the authority he had shown moments before, and after a brief pause, Emily offered a small, quiet smile, not triumphant, not relieved, simply grounded, as if the outcome had never been the point. And Daniel returned the gesture with a subtle nod, the kind that required no words. And around them, the restaurant resumed its rhythm. But it was not the same rhythm as before, because something had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be undone by returning to normal conversation or polished service. And for those who had witnessed it, the memory lingered in the details, the stillness, the restraint, the way dignity had held its ground without raising its voice. And across the room, Victoria finally took her seat, her movements slower, more deliberate, her gaze lowered not in defeat, but in reflection. And though the evening continued, though plates were served and glasses refilled, the lesson of the moment remained, quiet yet undeniable, carried in the silence between words, in the way people looked at one another, in the subtle awareness that appearances, status, and assumptions could all dissolve in a single instant. And as the night moved forward, one truth settled gently but firmly into the space, not spoken aloud, yet understood by all who had been there, that respect is not defined by what is seen, but by how one chooses to treat others when no consequence seems certain. And on that evening, in that room of polished marble and golden light, that truth had revealed itself in the most unexpected way.